So recently there's been a bit of a weird drama regarding the question of whether Margot Robbie, one of the most widely regarded as bombshell, hot, attractive, desirable actresses ever, is actually mid. And the weird thing was, I kind of agreed. I'd never found Margot Robbie particularly attractive. Whether it was when she was in her early 20s, or now when she's in like her early to mid 30s, she's never really... Nothing about Margot Robbie does much for me. So, yes, if asked, I would rank Margot Robbie a mid. E.g., I can't say she's actually physically ugly, but I feel very little looking at her. Speaking personally as a man, seeing some women say that someone like Henry Cavill, for example, is not that attractive, is quite a relief. It's a nice acknowledgement that taste exists. The whole idea of rating people out of 10, which is probably part of why the idea of Margot Robbie as the hottest actress about has came from, is kind of stupid. Not in so much that it's demeaning to people, but in that I don't think we actually believe the ratings we give. Nobody actually rates people out of 10 in their minds. Now personally, on a rating scale, I like to use 3s. Why? Because, well, wouldn't, not sure, would. It's quite simple, really, creating this bizarre, extensive categorization. I don't think people actually believe it. I think when someone says someone's a 10, they don't necessarily regard them as more attractive or desirable than, say, a 7. Like, what separates an 8 and a 9, or an 8 or a 7, or a 6 and a 7? At that point, the differences are so vague that I believe it has to come down to what I would like to call the games review problem. So what will happen is some review site will give a game that's been getting mostly 9s or 8s, like a 7 or an 8.5, and it will be a huge scandal. People will be arguing whether they were paid off, whether there was some conspiracy to rate something lower than something else. And the thing about games reviews is it tends to get really bad because partly due to the whole thing of multiple systems, meaning you tend to have people who like fanboy for exclusively PC games, games exclusively by Nintendo, by Sony, by Microsoft, etc. So it becomes this thing where the difference of a couple of points, not out of 10, out of 100, are a huge thing to get angry at. And the idea of, say, something getting an 8.8 instead of a 9 is tantamount to a declaration that you purposely were keen to knock down the score a few pegs on the Metacritic to, you know, maybe make the Wii's big game look less appealing than the Xbox 360's big game. This is dating myself a bit, but my point is it still goes on today, and we still have these huge dramas over very slight differences in score. Some review sites would literally rate things out of 1,000 to try and get the exact right placement. The problem here is that this obviously isn't how you experience something. You do not rate an experience out of 1,000. That's absurd. Instead, it turns into this weird scientific method where the reviewer kind of goes over every individual aspect and may rate something on visuals, playtime, fucking soundtrack, etc. Rates them all individually, and it's kind of stupid because it doesn't actually translate to a sensible rating of how much you thought something was worth your time, which is probably the most important factor. Instead, it's a bizarre kind of ultra-scientific approach which doesn't actually translate to a good rating. It merely translates to a rating that is easy to defend. And what's stupid is we're starting to apply that to people. We are rating people under the idea but we can defend the rating we give them rather than what we actually think. You want to rate someone a 10 because you think you can safely argue against anyone that they are actually attractive. And on some level, when we do this for pieces of entertainment like a game, it's not that bad. You're talking about a movie, game, fuck it, book, whatever. Attach a score and then argue to the death that it's the right score to give it. Now, personally, I don't really care for scores. When it comes to film in particular, I have tons of movies that are among my favourites, which fall well below the rotten. I don't really care if half the people who reviewed it didn't like it. If I think it's really good, then I'm going to call it really good. And I'm not going to care if the Rotten Tomatoes score says otherwise. When applying it to people, there's something gross about that, like it begins to fit into the skull measuring zone, which to be fair is already happening. I can be confident at least that my jaw is mostly fits the idea of what is a good jaw. And I understand the idea of wanting to feel like you are objectively attractive. Let me bring in my inner Jordan Peterson for a sec and talk about Disney movies. Because the original Snow White, think of the plot of that film. So your evil queen decides she's going to ask a mirror who is the fairest in the land, e.g. who is the hottest, who is the most close to a 10 on the scale. And you can't have to question why she's doing it, to be honest. I wonder if she's concerned about who her husband might be looking up. I mean, it's medieval times, the era of Henry VIII. You gotta worry if your head's gonna be chopped off when you're divorced. So she's asking, who's the most 10 in the land? And the mirror says, yeah, it's your 14-year-old niece. This idea of who is the most sort of conventionally attractive kind of changes with time. Like, we don't say it's a 14-year-old anymore. Like, that is not done. We kind of pretend they're not even on the scale. So, who is the most 10? Well, I guess a lot of people would answer Margot Robbie because she's like a tall, hot, blonde, white woman with, like, I guess reasonable sized tits. I don't find myself thinking about tits all that much. We're looking for what is the social ideal of a 10. And I thought, you know what? Let's cut people out and just ask an AI, what is a 10? Let's ask an AI, does Margot Robbie fit a 10? So I did that. I went on a website and decided to test out Margot Robbie's face. The face of two actresses I personally find more attractive. One I think is in her 40s, actually. You can make the argument that objectively, once you hit your 40s, you're downstream, you're no longer... See what I mean? So I do that, and I do myself. I get a picture of myself without makeup and with makeup. Now, what's interesting is this website ended up basically giving everyone a 6. Margot Robbie got a 6. I got a 6. Other two actresses got a 6. Only one who didn't get a 6 was me in makeup. So me in makeup is apparently a legendary 7 on the attractiveness scale. 70%. Over 70%. Me in makeup is killing it.
On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is couldn't really care less about the EU and 10 is I'm jumping on the couch like Tom Cruise on Oprah, how passionate are you about staying in the EU?
Oh, I'd put myself in the upper half of the 5 to 10, so we're looking at 7, 7.5.
Ooh, not quite.
Maybe 7.
The point of this whole experiment? Well, put simply, we all kind of scored a mid. I admit, me in makeup absolutely owned that. But then again, I should point out that I'm like 2 decimals off when I'm not in makeup, so hey. But there's an interesting little picture I want to show you. See this? This is what happens when you average out a woman's face of around the same age across numerous nationalities. And I would say they all look good. but they all could also be described as mid. But they could also be described as kind of ideally attractive, which is where it gets a bit weird. There's this page from this manga I really like, and it makes an interesting and astute point, and that's that good looking is basically having very little in the way of distinguishing characteristics. So in a way, mid is the most attractive there is. I often see these debates go on online regarding the scientific logic behind appearance. Like this idea that maybe if you were more secure in yourself, if you thought you were actually worth someone better, your sexual tastes would change, and maybe you would find a guy with massively built muscles hotter. Or maybe you'd find like Margot Robbie, blonde hair, bigger tits, taller, more attractive. I don't know. But I can say that my answer is actually not I don't know. It's no, just a no. I don't think so. I think we have hit the games review problem where people are trying to put an objective score on something that is not at all objective. It's simply a matter of preference. And much like the annoying fanboys who might scream that you didn't like something because it was too hard for you, or, oh, you weren't smart enough for this, it's simply in many cases not true. People generally just have different tastes and appearances, and yelling at them that actually they're wrong, particularly when it comes to human beings, is kind of gross. Like I said, it reminds me back of eugenics experiments and shit like that. There's something very creepy about that. That's part of why I really don't like this 1 out of 10, because these scores, because once again, it's quite simple. I can tell when I find someone definitely attractive, and I can tell when I find someone reasonable, I guess, and I can tell when someone's like, no matter how well we get on, I'm probably not going to want to sleep with you. It's quite simple. It does not need this scientific decimal point system to put it all into a logical range. And when you take that approach, you actually, going back to video games, you kind of hit the weird area where a lot of the Gamergate crowd ended up, arguing that porn stars should be cast in major blockbusters because it makes more sense because they're hotter to you. It's fucking stupid.